So did you see what happened to the Dow Jones yesterday? Yeah, down nearly 1,000 points. And that's on top of the markets either being nearly flat or down all week. Something is happening within the economy that has every alarm bell in my gut going off at once. On this episode, I have Kelsey Williams back on. Kelsey has worked in finance in one form or another for well over 40 years. He's the author of 2 books, Inflation, What It Is, What It Isn't, and Who's Responsible for It, and his second book, All Hail the Fed. He also has written and published many articles both for his website as well as other publications. All those resources can be found in the show notes. On this episode, we talk about gold. Look, purchasing gold can be kind of intimidating. Couple that with misconceptions on why someone should buy gold, and you have a recipe for being overwhelmed. Kelsey and I break down the history of gold, options for the way to purchase gold, and how he recommends you view owning gold. He also goes into the state of the economy today and even talk about some potential scenarios for where the economy is headed. And that's next on this episode of the Mormon Renegade Podcast. So I just want to take a moment to thank you, the listener. When I started this podcast, I wasn't sure if anyone would really listen. Now, to my surprise, this thing has taken on a life of its own. And that's all due to you, the listener, spending your time here with me, and it means a great deal to me. Now, as a husband and father, I'm keenly aware of how important time is. It feels like there's just never enough of it. So when you are spending your time here listening to this podcast, I feel a responsibility to never waste your time. In that spirit, as this podcast has grown, I feel like I need to do you, the listener, justice. I want to continue to produce good content and upgrade the audio quality. That takes better equipment and better software, and that all takes money. Now, I've tried to advertise, but you'd be surprised. There's not a lot of people wanting to advertise on a Mormon Fundamentalist podcast. I know, surprising, right? Now, if you want to help support the podcast, you can do that one of 2 ways. The first is go over to MormonRenegade.com and hit the Donate tab. There you can make a one-time donation, or you can go ahead and set it up to be a monthly recurring donation. Your choice entirely. Now, option number 2, because I'm a capitalist, if you want to head on over to MormonRenegade.com, click on the store button, you're going to find that we've got some new swag out. We got some t-shirts, we have a tote, we have cell phone cases, water bottles, coffee cups. We got a bunch of stuff, and more is going to be on the way. So, if you feel like that's something you could do, again, head on over to Mormon Renegade and check all that stuff out. If you're not in that position to do so, I completely understand. We're all squeezed right now with high gas prices and high inflation. So even if you can't, please keep listening and maybe keep the podcast in your prayers so we can continue to grow, produce good content, and better audio quality. Thank you.
You're listening to the Mormon Renegade Podcast.
Welcome back to the Mormon Renegade Podcast. As always, you can get a hold of me either by email at mormonrenegade@gmail.com. You can also get a hold of me on Instagram and Twitter and Getter under the handle Mormon Renegade. Also, we have a website up, and that's mormonrenegade.com, so go check that out. Welcome back to the Mormon Renegade Podcast, and we have back on Kelsey Williams. Now, you remember last time we had Kelsey on, we talked a lot about the Fed and inflation and really defining what that is. And as the economy tends to, continues to do weird things, I definitely wanted to keep in touch with Kelsey, and he has a phenomenal background in gold and understanding what gold is. And sometimes I feel like people look at gold as in, it's a great investment. And Kelsey, you can correct me if I'm wrong here. I don't look at gold as an investment, right? I look at it as kind of an insurance policy. Is that a good way of looking at it?
Much better than looking at it as an investment, very definitely. That'll get you messed up because it'll create unrealistic expectations based on what people think gold is supposed to do given things they see happening. Gold is real money. That's all it is. That's its only role. And the jewelry fabrication thing is secondary, and it will never replace or supplant gold's role as money. And that happened over thousands of years, not because somebody arbitrarily said it is.
Right. So let me ask you this, right? You and I know what I'm talking about when I say I get gold as an insurance policy.
Mm-hmm.
If someone was to come to you and say, Kelsey, what do you mean buy it as an insurance policy? How would you describe that to them?
A little concerned about how much emphasis people place on that, because it depends on what they're thinking might happen that would cause them to need it, and whether gold will respond to the conditions that they're concerned about. For example, people talk about the risk of recession and the economy getting really bad and assuming that gold is going to do really well because of that. That's not the case. It may, but it only depends on one thing. And it doesn't matter whether anything happens from an economic standpoint or not. It doesn't matter what the geopolitical risks, that's the term they like to use, are. It all comes down to purchasing power of the US dollar. The only reason the price of gold increases is to reflect the loss in purchasing power of the US dollar, which happens over a longer period of time. So when people say, well, okay, inflation is going to get really bad, gold's going to go up. But then again, they're not looking at where the price of gold is now relative to what's already happened. It just gets to be a little bit sketchy to use general terms like that and simply say, well, I'm buying some gold. Things are getting tough. Right now, people are crazy and I don't mean that literally. I mean, they think that I'm buying gold, things are going bad and it's going to get worse, and gold's what's going to save me. But all gold will allow you to do is preserve your purchasing power. And you may see a period where gold declines in price considerably because it's already at a level that reflects what has happened to this point. So maybe we back off, and gold has a history price-wise of doing that. That's not gold, that's to strengthen the dollar. And right now we're seeing some strength in the dollar, and people are saying, well, it's not going to last, but it could. And we could have deflation too. And if we have deflation, the price of gold is going down.
And correct me if I'm wrong here, right? People look at, quote, the price of gold and kind of make the connection that gold's worth is kind of tied to the dollar. And from my reading, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, gold isn't necessarily the dollar doesn't necessarily reflect the worth of gold. The dollar fluctuates, but gold ultimately kind of stays where it's at as far as its worth. Is that a correct assessment?
Gold is a long-term store of value, and its value is in its use as money. And terms of value, that value is stable and constant over the centuries. All paper currencies fluctuate, mostly going down over time because all governments inflate and destroy their own currencies intentionally. As long as they expand the supply of money and credit, the currency is going to lose value. And over time, gold, since it's priced in US dollars, reflects the decline that's happened.
Right. And that's what I was trying to say, but you just did it way better.
Well, there's a mathematical calculation you can use too. It's
really?
Generally, and this is, based on most of what we can see, the US dollar has lost 98 to 99% of its purchasing power over the last century. So it takes $100 today to buy what you could have bought 100 years ago. Now, obviously, you have a lot of changes in technology and everything. I'm just saying that if you go back and you look at how people, even 50 or 60 years ago, how much was $50,000 in income? Now we have people talking about $500,000 in income correlated to the same idea and control in terms of what you can buy with it. So you've got I think it's very reasonable that the dollar has declined 99% what you can buy. So it's about 100-to-1 ratio. Now, when gold was at $2,000 an ounce or slightly above that, twice in the last couple of years, that represents a 100-fold increase from the price of gold when the two were fixed. 20 US dollars for an ounce of gold. So you have the dollar and gold linked on a fixed basis. It doesn't matter what it was before or anything, as long as that ratio is maintained, and it was for a number of years. And then what happened is government wants to expand their horizons by spending more money, inflating the money supply. They can't do that if it's, tied to gold. So they cut those ties. And see, that's the big issue. Gold, it acts as a restraint on government. So if the money supply is gold, or if you have a fixed link and convertibility is there, so that you can turn in your dollars and get a fixed amount of gold that was agreed upon, and it stays that way, that's fine. The problem is government's not going to stop printing more money and making more credit available. So what that does is it cheapens the value of all that money, meaning they couldn't redeem gold for what they said they would after they've continued to expand the money supply. So what gold does is it gives you a longer term store of value.
Gotcha.
And that's the way to approach it.
And see, in my silly mind, I don't look at it nearly as scientifically as you do. I look at it as in, this is for after just something catastrophic with the economy, and then we have to kind of almost reboot the system, right?
That's okay, because it depends on whether the dollar survives. See,
Right.
That's the issue. As long as the dollar is accepted, then you're not going to see the kind of situation that some people talk about. If people reject dollars at some point, then that is where the gold comes in.
Right.
In terms of that last. But there are other opportunities along the way to accumulate gold at what would be considered bargain prices when it moves away from its inflation adjusted value. And right now we're very close to the inflation adjusted value. So there isn't a whole lot of what you might call profit potential in it. And besides, if things did happen the way some people think they might, meaning let's say that everything gets away from us, inflation's, the effects of inflation skyrocket, the dollar loses value drastically, and people simply say, I don't want the dollars. Well, the price of gold will go up in that situation, but you won't profit from it because it'll take that much, gold. It'll take the gold will buy the same thing then as it would now. The fact that it's priced at $4,000 or $5,000 an ounce doesn't matter, because everything you buy will have gone up proportionately to that loss in the dollar's purchasing power. So it's a way to preserve your wealth and purchasing power over long periods of time.
Gotcha. So let's go back a little bit, because I want to talk a little bit about the history of the gold of gold.
Okay.
Because realistically, as I've looked at it, it seems like almost every currency starts with gold, right or wrong?
Well, gold was money before the dollar and before paper currencies. What happened is, people, the first gold coins were about 500 years ago, 500 years before, 500 years BC. So you've got 2,600 years of use of gold, and that was money. But that was coins. But before that, it was bullion, and gold bullion was stored in warehouses. And people had receipts because they weren't going to carry around gold bullion bars everywhere they went. So they had receipts where it was stored in warehouse, and those receipts from the warehouse were negotiable in trade and commerce. So if someone was buying something, it was always in terms of gold, and they had a receipt signifying that, so they could transfer ownership of the gold by returning that receipt over to someone if they wanted to buy something. Then, of course, there were people who would come and they wanted to get their gold, they turn in a receipt and they take it. And so, but that's how it was stored. And then there was the proprietors of the warehouse who decided that maybe if most of the gold continues to stay here, because not everybody wasn't going to come and get all their gold at once, and the receipts were traded and people would get the receipts from someone else, and then they'd use it again in their other transactions. So what would happen is the proprietors of the warehouses, who really were the originators of banking, they were like bankers, they decided, well, why can't we loan this gold out? There's a receipt with the evidence that it's backed by the gold that's stored in the warehouse. We just have to be careful not to loan too much out, and certainly not loan more out than the available supply that's in storage. And so they'd loan it out, charge interest on it. Well, that's the banking system, okay? And the receipts were a forerunner of checks.
And in essence, that's what the American dollar was kind of based on, right? It was essentially a check that.
Well, it's an IOU.
It's an IOU,
It
right?
used to be convertible directly into gold, and that's where the link was. See, if I know that I use gold and gold has a function as money and it's accepted, and the government says, well, we need our own currency. So when the government wanted to have its own currency, it knew that it wasn't going to be accepted unless people knew that it was real in some way. So they tied it to gold and silver. Gold being primarily the real money, silver used for smaller walking around, but even people carried $10 and $20 gold pieces. That was, 100 years ago, as silver dollars. That was money. The use of the paper currency was convenient, but people weren't going to accept it unless they knew that it equated it to a certain amount of gold. So you had a fixed ratio. You knew that if you owned gold, you could willingly exchange it for a fixed amount of paper dollars and vice versa. What happened, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to.
I'll go on until you stop me.
What was it about gold that seemed to be every civilization's go-to? Was it its scarcity? Was it its function in something? I mean, why gold? Why not silver or copper?
Part of this, first of all, there's trial and error. A lot of things were tried. What worked over a longer period of time, and people became and understood that it would work and realized it was gold. I mean, it was just trial and error. They tried beads, they tried seed grain, I mean, anything. But there are three characteristics of money, and that really helps us determine, we can see how gold works and why other things don't. And I mean, gold has its own characteristics. First of all, it's scarce. And that's important because the limited supply means you don't have the risk or the issue of inflation if you have a limited supply. It's hard to get. 99% of the supply of gold that's been mined historically is available above ground today. So it doesn't rust, it doesn't tarnish, it's scarce, it's beautiful, but that's all great, but it meets the test of what I say is real money. And real money has three characteristics. One, it's a medium of exchange. Two, it's a measure of value. And three, it's a store of value. Now, in order to be a medium of exchange, it has to be recognized and accepted. People have to see something that they say, okay, this is fine. I will take this. And so others use it. That's what we look at. Whether you're talking about dollars or gold, I accept it. It's a medium of exchange. It goes between, and people use it in their transactions. It gets used over and over again. It also needs to be a measure of value. The measure of value has to be, the money that's being used has to be able to be divided into quantities, fractional units that can be used in a recognized standard of weights and measure. Well, gold is perfect for that. That's how we got grams, grains, all the other metric system units of gold. Small units so that it can be used in daily transactions as well. So you got medium of exchange and measure of value. Now, dollars fit that. They're medium of exchange and a measure of value. How many dollars are you going to pay for something? But here's the test. The test is a store of value, the third item, the third characteristic. This is the distinction between money and real money. You have to be able, if you come to me and you want to buy something that I have, and I ask, well, what are you going to give me in return? If you give me some form of money, I have to know that I can accept that and that I can turn around and use it again. And if I don't want to use it right now, I want to use it a year from now or several years from now. Maybe I'm not going to use it right away. Maybe a portion of this I'm going to set aside. I have to be able to know and be confident enough that I can go get that money at any time and turn around and use it, and then I can still buy what I can buy right now with it. Okay, that's store of value. What will it buy me next year? I have tuition coming up next year for a child or something. Well, the tuition is locked in at this point. What am I going to pay for that? What am I going to use to pay for that? But if that money isn't worth a year from now or 5 years from now what it is now, then I either have to be confident enough that it's a slow rot and I can find another way to use that money to grow it to offset that, or I have to have something that's going to be a store of value. So that's where gold comes in. And again, long term. I can look back and show you 30 years ago, 50 years ago, people get caught up and they say, well, inflation, as they call it, the price increase is 8 or 9% over the last 6 or 8 months. They want to see gold do that, but that's unrealistic. Because gold reacts only after longer periods of time, and it did reflect that full change over a long period of time when it increased to over 2,000 an ounce. So you get that, you want to put the money away. So gold meets the test of those three things: long-term store of value, medium of exchange, measure of value. And that's what I call real money.
No, that makes perfect sense. It has all three of those characteristics. So when the United States dollar is first established, right? And I'm talking the actual Federal Reserve note, not what we had in the Articles of Confederation, but after that, after the Constitution's established, we start our own currency. And in theory, in those days, you could say, I got $3 here. I want to take this to the bank and get $3 worth of gold. That all makes sense. And it's pretty impressive the way you described it, that it was that gold that really, and its, inability, or I should say, its function of not being able to walk around with gold bullion, that really gives rise to this idea of script, if you will.
Right.
So America's on that gold standard, I guess, for lack of a better term. How long is America on that gold standard?
Well, the critical change happened in 1934, and that's when President Roosevelt issued an executive order that made holding of gold by U.S. citizens illegal. Okay, you had to turn in the gold,
and that was even jewelry too, right? I remember reading about this somewhere.
Well, yeah, I think to the jewelry, it would have to be jewelry in a sense that wasn't, if people had a hoard of jewelry that they could go melt down, that would be a concern. But primarily, it was the risk and the threat that the gold as currency affected the US government's plans to fight the deflation and the depression that was underway by expanding the supply of money and credit. And they couldn't do that and still maintain the convertible link. So they raised the price of gold on an official basis, meaning you now have to turn in $35 to get an ounce of gold, when it used to be that was convertible at 20, because we knew the government had been inflating and they couldn't keep inflating without cheapening the value of the dollars again. So they said, okay, you're right. So we'll raise the official price to 35. But US citizens weren't allowed to turn it in at that. They had to turn it in at $20 an ounce, the official link. Then the higher price really was raised to for anybody else who owned it, foreign governments or holders of dollars. So it effectively undercut their holdings, because now they just lost 40% of their dollar reserve by raising or what they thought was related to gold at $20 an ounce. So, but again, it was the threat that gold made for the government. The government can't go out and spend limitless amounts of dollars when it knows it has to be able to exchange those dollars for a fixed amount of gold at what was $20 an ounce. So that threat was enough for Roosevelt to issue an executive order and take away gold ownership.
So how did he do that though? I mean, how was he able to gather that up? Did people just surrender it voluntarily? Was this something that they somehow knew that folks had gold somewhere? I mean, what was the mechanism there?
They relied on that, just what you said, as like an honor system. If they knew about it, they could, of course, use that threat. And the next thing would be, what are you going to do? If you go out and use it, somebody would find out that you had it. So, and I think, again, you're at a time where in the middle of a depression, the demand for actual cash was such that a lot of people didn't see the risk and felt that was the thing to do. And it also, there was the appeal of, and I don't like the use of it, but the appeal of the term patriotism, that if you didn't turn this, you weren't going to help us get out of this mess. And, you're being unpatriotic if you didn't understand how this affected the dollar and the economy and everything else. And that, I really think they used everything at their disposal to make it stick. But again, it was an executive order. I mean, they could turn around and do the same thing today. There's whether it's not whether it's right or wrong, it's the fact that, government doesn't like something and they can't get the courts to do it. They'll find a way to do it. And it was also supposed to be temporary. It wasn't lifted until George Bush issued an executive order reversing it. But that just made it legal. It didn't restore convertibility, which means if you are concerned and want to protect yourself, you buy gold. It's not illegal, so you buy it. And the free markets, allow you to buy and sell it as you want to. But the US dollar has no substance behind it.
So that purchase, because I'd always read, and this is why I love talking to you. I'd always read that the reason that FDR issued that order was to help fund the war effort. But you're saying in all actuality, it was to try to help with the Depression. Is that correct?
Well, he certainly would have used it to fund the war effort, but that was 6 or 7 years later before the US entered the war. He was in the midst of a deflationary depression in 1934. The US was, and stocks were at their lowest, had lost 90% of their value, or where they were priced before the crash. And you've got all the government programs. How are you going to pay for them? Create some money. And you can't create money because as the money comes back in and people start using it, they say, hey, I want some gold. Well, we've got a fixed ratio of $20 an ounce. That's going to be obvious that the government isn't keeping their part of the agreement. So let's just call it what it is, and we'll make it easier by taking gold away from people. So whether it was war or anything else, it allowed government to expand the money supply without the risk associated with trying to have people redeem gold, because the US would have given up everything it had to meet those redemptions.
Wow. So after FDR, after that happens, what's the next step with US and gold?
Well, not a lot until the late 60s. You had a period where the US, most of the attention was trying to find our way out of the Depression, which would have happened a good deal sooner had it not been for the government's efforts to intervene and try to support everything, prop it up, and also fight against the symptoms that really needed to happen in order for the economy to get better. But so you have that, and then the entrance into the war in 1941, December 1941. There was an acceleration of economic activity that helped, I guess, if you want to say it, but all it really does is take productive means away from other areas and put them into areas that supported the war effort. But it was obviously there. So you have a period then through the war, but you had a lot of rationing because they needed materials and everything else. So economically, things weren't that great, but the dollar was reasonably stable. And to a certain extent, then the effects of inflation had a big impact once the war effort subsided, because all of this money and effort is out there. So inflation was a concern, but then as the economy picked up, 50s and 60s were relatively good financially and economically. But in the mid to late 60s, a lot of the foreign governments who were accumulating dollars, including Arab countries for the sale of oil, at ridiculously cheap prices, people, they realize that, these dollars we keep accumulating have lost a substantial amount of their purchasing power. They can't buy what they could 10, 15, 20 years ago with them. And so they started asking for their gold, which was at a fixed price of $35 an ounce. And the government said, we're not going to do that. So they kept stalling. And then finally, President Nixon said, okay, we're going to, well, actually a couple of years earlier, they raised the official price again to 42. Again, it's like going back to the store, and every time you ask for what you're entitled to, they tell you the price has been raised. Because
sorry, I was going to say it sounds a lot. It sounds, doesn't sound it is crooked, right? I mean, because essentially what we did is we told the rest of the world, you just give us our gold, use the dollar as kind of the world reserve currency, and you can come get your gold anytime you want until you want it. And then we're not going to give it to you.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, they agreed. Well, see, when they issued the dollars were issued with that. It used to say it right on the dollar. But officially that changed when they outlawed ownership of gold for US citizens, but it was still legally binding for holders of dollars, foreign holders of dollars, non-US citizens, if you will. So yeah, and I mean, nobody could do what was done in business and not be accused of doing something illegal or criminal, or there'd be some term. The legality of it would be questioned, but it wasn't questioned, or if it was questioned, there wasn't enough support to do something about it, or the force of government was too great. So I mean, however you look at it, that's the way it was. It happened, and it stayed that way. And then finally, President Nixon in 1971 severed that final link. And he said, okay, we're in France, we're not going to give you your gold. You can't have it because we're not going to allow it anymore. We're just not going to return it. You have dollars, that's it. It's not convertible. So they reneged on their convertibility clause to the holders of dollars. And that's when we saw gold skyrocket.
So let me ask you two questions here real quick. And both of them are kind of hypothetical, but I'm curious what your thoughts are. Where is all that gold that other countries gave us?
Well, it wasn't so much that they gave us, it was gold. They accepted dollars instead of gold for transactions. See, if you come to me and you say, look, I want something that you have, and I'm willing to pay for it, and I say, okay, I'll sell it to you. What are you going to give me? And you say, I can either give you gold or I can give you dollars. And I'll say, well, I would prefer the gold. Well, if you'll take the dollars, we can do this transaction a lot simpler. We don't have to ship the gold to you, and your dollar is convertible into that fixed amount of gold when you want it. And then the deal's done. And we just credit. And it's gotten easier and easier with digital money. You just click a computer mouse and the transaction's done. So anyway, foreign countries, foreign holders of gold, and originally US citizens said, great, it's really convenient. I take the dollar. I know I can turn it in for a fixed amount of gold. I'm not worried about it. It's a store of value. It's a medium of exchange, and it's a measure of value. So I tuck it away and I go on my way. Comes back, I go to use it, and it's like, I want to turn it back for a certain amount of gold. And you say, no. I know I told you I would, but I'm not going to. I accepted the dollars from you. Now, that's assuming you and I have that control individual between us. But now think of the transactions. I accepted the dollars only because I knew I could turn them in at a central place and get gold because the Federal Reserve had guaranteed that.
So we didn't, I'm just trying to think. The only reason I could think of that we wouldn't have redeemed it that from other countries, right, when they came back to try to buy gold with their dollars, is that we didn't really have that much gold to be handing out. Is that correct?
Exactly, because we printed too much money, or we expanded the supply of money and credit over time, whether it was printing dollars or crediting somebody with dollars or whatever. There's too much, and that goes back to the example of the warehouse and the banks. You got the bullion in the banks, you got warehouse receipts, and if you loan out bullion, since people aren't coming and getting it all the time and collect interest on it, that's fractional reserve banking. That's what we have today. That's and so it really is just the series of events is not anything unusual because it's the normal course of action for governments to inflate their currency. And that's why people trusted gold. You can't go out and just arbitrarily say, here's more gold for you. You either have it or you don't.
Right.
But you can do that with a currency that you can print more of.
Okay, so here's my second hypothetical question. Let's just say that you're President Kelsey of Williams Island, right? You're the president. And you've made this deal and you have all these dollars. It's the world's reserve currency. But let's just say that we overinflate our dollar, right? We debase the currency.
Okay.
If that currency, pardon the expression, takes a dump, aren't you going to be mad at the United States?
Well, yeah, I would think so. I mean, but the United States isn't alone in this. All governments inflate and destroy their own currencies. It's just a matter, it's a matter of, they're always arguing about the relative value of one currency versus another. So we're all playing the same game. It's paper versus real money, gold. And that's really what it comes down to. Now, if a country is less obvious or less, what do I want to say? Maybe they're more conservative in their approach and they don't go completely overboard on the inflation side. There's not too many countries that I'm aware of out there. But the idea is there are relative differences in the strength of currencies based on how that currency is perceived at any given time. So the US dollar, by almost any account, is still the strongest, most widely accepted currency form of money. It doesn't mean they haven't done things to ruin it, because obviously if a dollar today is only worth 99% less than it was 80 or 90 or 100 years ago, then that's just a little bit of inflation all the time, a cumulative process. And then you got smaller world countries, what they call third world countries, like Zimbabwe and Argentina, smaller countries that go out and they literally recklessly print all of the currency they can. There's a history for that. And again, what happens is, they don't have the support for their currency that the US does because they don't have the concentration of it. So they literally ruined their own currency by printing more of it, which is what happened to Germany, the Weimar Republic, in the late 20s or throughout the 20s when they tried to finance all of the debts they were paying from World War I. They agreed to, the part of the treaties was to pay back damages and claims from the war, World War I. And they finally said, we're just going to print it and pay it. Well, that's why they had runaway inflation, hyperinflation in Germany. People, today it's more a matter of looking at everything and seeing, well, what are the risks? I mean, if I'm in the US, what are the risks to me? And how do I want to protect myself? What are the threats that what are the things that could happen? I don't think that hyperinflation, it could happen, but I don't think that's as big a risk as some people say it is. And that's something we can get into another point, but I just don't see it. I've written about it, but I don't believe that it's the risk that others do. I think the bigger risk is a credit collapse and a full-scale depression, meaning economically and financially, it'll be as bad or worse as the Great Depression. And that's going to mean the value of anything that is priced in dollars is going to drop considerably. It's going to drop whether it's real estate, whether it's oil, gas. Now, everything's going to have its own supply and demand issues. We're totally separate, so they aren't all going to uniformly drop, but you're definitely going to see a radical change. And that to me is a bigger risk. Now, is the hyperinflation a possibility? Yes, it is. It's definitely a possibility. And that's something that you would just have to look and say, okay, if I've got gold, that will certainly, I know that its worth or value will be there. So I'll have some. But gold's already at its inflation, close to its inflation adjusted value. So the question is what's the probability that we'll have hyperinflation at this point versus a deflation or a depression and a credit collapse? So you're going to start looking at timelines and trying to judge which risk is greater and to what extent. So you can't, it's not easy today. You also have to allow for the fact that things could get better. Things might get better and they might stay that way. I mean, look at stocks. I mean, if you ignored stocks, every time things look like they're going to fall apart, the Fed pulls a rabbit out of the hat and they're able to manage things, or people respond in a way that allows us to get back on track to some degree. So it's very difficult, but I personally believe we're closer than ever to a collapse. And the more likely scenario would be a deflationary collapse. But once that happens, the Fed and the US government will pull out all the stops, just like they did when they shut down the economy forcibly 2 years ago. You saw what the Fed did then, and the government did, is we're going to create money and we're going to make it available. Now, what happens is if the forces of that deflation are too great, then what they do won't have an impact. And that's where I think it's going to get out of control, unless they literally overwhelm the dollar and you'll be in the midst of a deflationary crisis and they literally destroy the dollar by making it worthless by, all right, we're going to give everybody $100,000. Well, there you go. We're done. but they might try that. And see, the problem is we don't know what they're going to do, except that they're going to do everything they can to maintain their viability and their system of operation, not what's right for us.
So there's a couple of things there I want to unpack, because I think you illuminated some things. So describe for me what the conditions on the ground would look like versus a credit collapse versus a massive versus like hyperinflation.
Okay. Credit collapse would be a cascading effect of, because you would find, remember the auto loan debacle and how, and education loans and mortgages, how much is your house worth? It's priced in dollars. You have a deflation and economic depression. People are out of work. They can't generate income. They can't pay their mortgage. They can't make their car payments. Okay, so you can carry that forward and realize what that does. So economic activity is there. The prices of those items drops considerably because they're not worth what we thought they were. They were only, their price was, the loan was based on a certain price that people pay. That price drops automatically, pretty close to automatically, as people can't make their mortgage payments or their car payments. But that's nothing. Think of everything economically that happens, all our transactions, everything is based on credit and digital money. And where does it go? I mean, it just goes up in smoke. And then you have a government and central bank that says, we can't let this happen. We're going to have to help people. We're going to spend a lot of money to do it. Now, the ability of the government to create money today is a lot simpler and quicker than it was 80 years ago. So, you know, what the Roosevelt's programs to put people back to work and all the other government programs and all the creation of money that took place pales in comparison to what we can do today. So they will fight. And this is the problem. People make an assumption that because a certain thing happens and that's it, government will react. We don't know how they'll react, except that they will do whatever is in their best interest, not ours. And their best interest is keeping the system intact so they can keep on spending and passing laws and telling us what to do. And the Fed, that's a banker's bank. The Fed will do everything possible to maintain a system that allows them to continue to lend or to create money and lend it. So with that logic understood and those motivations understood, now you look at what might happen or not. It's too easy to simply say, well, if that happens, the Fed will do this. Fed's not going to do anything that you think they're going to do just because that seems the logical thing to do. They're going to do what they feel they need to do to keep their end of the thing intact. And if you suffer for it, so be it.
Wow. My next question, both with the Weimar Republic and with Zimbabwe, they each had massive hyperinflation.
Correct.
Because they debased the currency, right?
That's right.
Okay, so what prevents, because we've massively debased our currency, especially during COVID, right? You can take it back further to the collapse of 2008 when we bailed out all the banks. And the banks were even the banks that didn't want money. It's my understanding that they were kind of had their arm twisted and said, no, you're going to take this money because if y'all take it, we don't know who's really in trouble.
Right.
Going back to the .com bubble, right? That was a bailout that took cash.
Right.
So at what has prevented and what makes hyperinflation unlikely at this point? Because if we look at what Weimar did, and that was the ruling party, I guess you will, or the ruling class right before Hitler takes power, right? It's out of that fear of hunger and everything that Hitler comes to power. What has they just fired up the printing presses and just printed all this money to pay their war debt, right? And all their penalties for being in World War I. Zimbabwe is just Zimbabwe, as far as I can tell. Someone thought it was a good idea, but what prevents that from happening here?
Okay,
because we printed more money than either of those or both those countries combined, correct?
Right. I mean, I don't have any idea, but it's not so much the quantity, it's the quantity relative to the supply. The supply of dollars, what the US did in terms of the supply of dollars doesn't necessarily equate similarly one way or the other to what Zimbabwe or Weimar Republic did, because the supply of their currency is totally different. And the recognition of their currency for use is totally different. So, but it could be that way, but it's not necessarily going to, because one thing the dollar does have as the reserve currency, there's a certain factor, and so many people are dependent on dollars that you don't have quite the same risk for that reason. So status, strength, and need or dependency on dollars. Two, certain transactions, because the world dollar is the world reserve currency, are transacted in dollars. And the two commodities that are transacted in dollars on an international basis are gold and oil. And three, the other thing is that the effects of the Fed's inflation are losing their intended impact. So over the years, the more and more the purchasing power that we lose over time, it takes more and more inflation by the Fed to create it. So we can see a decline that as the amount of the expansion of the supply of money and credit goes up, and that trajectory is very steep, the impact and the effects of it are declining. So we're not getting the bang for the buck. The Fed, like a drug addict, has to create more and more inflation in order to get the effects they're looking for. But it's unpredictable. There's no way to gauge it. And again, and I think we touched on this before, think of a drug addict. That first fix feels really good and it didn't take much. The next fix isn't going to feel quite so good and you need a little bit more. And that's how you become addicted. And that's where we are in terms of dollars and credit. Primarily credit, because that's how they expand the money supply. If I can fund a purchase with credit, I buy it. I mean, that's the way it is. That's the way the world functions today. So anything that affects that, that's implosion. Credit collapse, the prices of everything drop. Then the Fed comes out and just goes crazy in order to fight that. Now, or will they? I assume they will. They're still going to do whatever they need to. And that's when you may see that hyperinflation risk, if they can overwhelm and overcome those effects. But I think the deflation and the credit collapse will be so huge that there's nothing the Fed can do about it. And that what that does is allows them and the government to put all their programs into effect without creating hyperinflation, because the effects of the deflation counter that.
I got
So,
you.
all of those are issues, but again, the possibility is there. I just don't, I think that a credit collapse is more likely. But
I got you.
after a credit collapse, at some point, that hyperinflation risk could be much greater.
So we could be hit doubly hard. I mean, there's that possibility too.
Yeah, yeah. But you see, whatever comes first, it still ends in a depression. You still have an economic collapse.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I was going. Whether it's hyperinflation or whether it's a banking collapse, the results are the same, right?
Correct.
Like if you had like Ebola and cancer both, does it really matter which one killed you? The effects are the same.
Yeah, yeah. The U.S. dollar, like most all currencies, is terminally ill, and it has periods of time where that illness is in remission, seemingly so. But in the context of the big picture, it's just marching progressively toward that final end. And that's the way currencies are, because governments always inflate and destroy their own currencies.
And really being tied to that gold standard, if we could somehow figure it out to make it stick, that's the vaccine, if you will. I mean, a real working vaccine to the problems we're seeing now, right? If a government would stay on the gold standard.
It could work, but remember, and this is what I think is the biggest argument against expecting or seeing that, is no government is going to voluntarily agree to do something like that because it ruins everything else that they're doing. In other words, they lose their control and power to the extent they agree to convertibility, not just backing it. It has to be convertible. People have to be able to exchange the dollars or whatever currency it is and get physical gold for it. If otherwise, the convertibility doesn't mean anything. And then can they be trusted? Are they going to stop printing dollars because there's convertibility? Not likely. And that means we eventually see the same thing again. So it'll be very difficult. You'd have to have some big changes in government, and the attitudes of those who are there. I don't care what their political affiliation is. Most of them simply aren't going to do something that's going to stop them from spending like drunken sailors, or stop the Federal Reserve from being able to expand, or banks from being able to expand the credits supply and lend more money. So they're not going to voluntarily give that up, and neither are other governments in other countries. So there would have to be some real awakening by the world over to see something along those lines.
Gotcha. So how would, in those situations where we're talking about utter economic devastation, how does gold help the average person having gold?
If we're talking about economic devastation, it depends on what's happening with the US dollar. The Great Depression was economic travesty. I mean, the amount of, you're talking about 25 to 30% people unemployed at a peak, and then staying at 20% for the remainder of the 30s. That's economic devastation. And that's official numbers. How much worse was it? And so, but the dollar was strong. See, the currency itself bought more because stock prices, real estate prices, everything collapsed. So you have economic devastation, but the US dollar increased in purchasing power. You could go out and you could buy more during the Depression with your dollars. It's just that there weren't that many dollars out there. And that's the situation now. Is the same thing. It's the strength and purchasing power of the dollar. So if you have hyperinflation, the dollar's worthless, then gold retains its purchasing power. It doesn't mean you profit from it. It's that you can buy with that gold, even if the dollar's worthless, what you can buy today. That's where gold comes in a situation like that. If you have a collapse in the economy and a credit collapse and the prices of goods and services decline, which they will when the economic activity declines as well, prices of everything goes down, then you have a stronger US dollar. That means you can buy more with it. The price of gold will decline. But in terms of purchasing power, it's going to cost you less for those things. So you may still be able to buy comparable amounts with the gold you have. It's just that in terms of the price, it will definitely be lower. So it depends on how high it was relative to all this, as everything seeks a value, depending on those changes, either up or down, what's the price in dollars. So you'll see the price drop along with everything else. And so it's not necessarily, in either case, it's a matter of purchasing power, but that means that the real purchasing power increase is going to come by holding dollars if it's a deflationary collapse. Just the opposite of what people are looking for, at least initially, until the government decides to do something to fight it or make it better.
Wow.
If we have a traditional credit collapse, the price of gold will go down.
Right.
Okay. And that's all there is to it. Now, if you can buy a house for, I like to use, what's the price with an 80% mortgage and you got a house that's $1 million. And if we have a price collapse, how much is that house valued? Let's say it drops 80%. That's not unrealistic if there's a total collapse.
If it
Now,
drops,
okay,
yeah.
So does the price of gold drop comparably or not? But I know there's going to be a price for that gold. If I can still buy the house, I haven't lost in terms of purchasing power, because that's what money is. Its value is in what you can buy with it. The only reason gold is priced in dollars has to do with the system we have, which was part of the Bretton Woods Agreement and the US's influence that made the US dollar the reserve currency, and all transactions in what two things, critical items, are going to be the most important: dollars and oil. And what that means is if you own any other currency, if you're a holder of any other currency, it still depends on what your currency is valued relative to the dollar in order to see how much it's going to cost you. And that, again, is one of the reasons because that the dollar has strength. It may, you'll see disruptions, but as long as those things are there, there's nothing else. And even if they weren't, people talk about a reserve currency, something else. What's going to replace the dollar? What are people going to say? Oh yeah, I want to hold Chinese yuan. Is the renminbi better than the dollar, or is the euro better than the dollar? No, I don't think that'll work. They've got their own problems. I can see why they would want the US dollar displaced, but it doesn't mean there's an answer for it. and there's something else will work better.
Gotcha. So it really is dependent upon what kind of economic crisis we're dealing with, where gold determines how much gold can help.
And that's why there's always a reason to have cash, liquid, as an emergency, as much as it is dollars. They're both money. We just don't know what's going to happen. If you want to be totally apocalyptic, you put 50% of your reserves in cash and 50% in gold and go back to sleep. But that would mean you'd be giving up the opportunity for any investment profits. And, so you wouldn't necessarily do that with anything. Just depends on what's your sleep threshold,
Right.
How convinced are you that we're going to see this and how soon? And how much are you willing to bet on that particular scenario?
Right. So what all have we missed in the history of gold? I feel like we glossed over it really quickly.
I don't know that we've necessarily missed anything, because I think what's important is that people recognize gold is not just real money, it's original money. Gold was money before the dollar, before other currencies. The dollar as a currency has a history of well over 200 years. There's nothing wrong with that. And it was tied to fixed ratios. And as long as that was there and governments kept their promise, it's fine. So it's like, I can remember as a kid, I'd say, hey, this says pay to the bearer on demand, $20 in gold, $20 in gold. And then the next time I looked at something, it said pay to the bearer on demand, $5. What? Why? What's the difference? And I started thinking to myself, wait a second. So if I turn this in, they're going to give me $5 back. Why is that? I started asking all sorts of questions when I was a kid about this kind of stuff. So the history is there. Okay. The history goes back a long time, and it's a gradual erosion of independence and personal freedom.
And see, that's what I don't think that and it took me years to make this connection, right? Is that realistically, one of the promises, I shouldn't say promises. Well, yeah, one of the promises of the United States was that if you worked hard, if you did what you were supposed to, if you made good decisions, you could get to a point to where you could buy your financial freedom, right?
Mm-hmm.
By investing, by making sound financial decisions. If you've tied yourself to one specific kind of investment or currency, you're not really free. You're kind of dependent upon that. So with gold, you always have an ability in some catastrophic situations to maintain that freedom. And it took me years to put that all together, because you don't necessarily think about freedom being tied to money, but it really is the truth, right? I mean, that's the whole point of having a paid off mortgage, is in hopes of not having that mortgage there. Although then they soak you in property taxes, but you get closer. So it took forever. And do you think that's been hard for people to put that together because of the way that they've been taught, or the fact that we just take for granted that the dollar is always worth something? Why is it so hard for people to wrap their minds around that?
It's a good question, but we're not told the truth, that's for sure. And we're told things in ways that color it differently, like the term rose-colored glasses. Everybody has an opinion, but it's based on what they hear and what they're told. and what they hear and what they're told aren't always the same, and they're usually not correct and factual. For example, when you read something in the media at all or hear a news report, there is an intention behind what you're told to paint a picture a certain way. And certain things are not included in that report or that article because they will alter the impression that's given and intended to be given. Then you have people who view events, see them, hear about them, and we're all different. So we all come up with our own impression about what that means. You could have 3 eyewitnesses to an event, and every one of them is going to come away with a different description or idea about it. That some change or variation of the facts. So, yeah, you throw that into the mix and go back, and if you're not thinking about it, if you're not looking, you're not going to see the gradual erosion that takes place over time, little by little. That's why we talk about dollars today. You and I are sitting have a conversation we could have very well have had 20 years ago. We could have had it 30 years ago. What's the difference in the purchasing power of the dollar today versus 20 years ago or 30 years ago? You know, when I got out of college, and we can go back farther, it's not unrealistic. I mean, I graduated from college in 1970. Before the oil embargo and the events of the 70s, I think it used to cost me $2 to fill up my tank.
Oh.
Gas was 25 cents a gallon. You know, when I was a kid, I'd ride my bicycle to the store and I'd buy the small bottles of 7-Up, ice cold in a machine. They were like 7 or 8 ounces, a nickel. And I could get a candy bar, a big candy bar, for a nickel. And I'd buy a comic book for 10 cents and I'd ride my bicycle home. And that was in the 60s, early to mid 60s.
Man, we've just.
I can't go back and tell you here's when things changed, because everything proceeded very realistically and normal. And then I look at some of my memorabilia and I pull out a letter or something and it's got a 3-cent stamp on it. And now we're talking about 60 cents. I'm like, well, that happened a little bit at a time. People don't read. We didn't see it go from 3 cents to 60. We saw it go from 3 cents to 4 cents. We saw it go from 4 cents to 5 cents. Well, I saw all of that. I can remember change. It was all silver. And even after Lyndon Johnson, there was silver in circulation. They just weren't minting it that way. So it happens a little bit at a time. And other than, I think, special events like President Roosevelt, President Nixon, and we look back at certain wars and things like that, but we really don't see the changes until we take time and look back and jump a couple decades back and say, wow, that was an event. That was really something. That was significant. They raised the price of something, or they did that, and they had never done that. And then it becomes, hey, Postal Service has raised the prices 3 times in the less than a year and a half, because I ship a lot of stuff out, media mail, because of my eBay stuff. I do vinyl records and stuff like that. And it's like, I watched the price, email and audio stuff. And at one point, a few years ago, it was like $2.80, and then it was $3.19, and then it was $3.40 and $3.89, and it's just progressive. And so at some point, people wake up and they say, as it happens more quickly, and then they say, I need to do something. I need to protect myself. But
Well,
we're not going to see the awakening, I don't think, until something catastrophic happens.
sure. Let me ask you this, because there seems to be some exponential returns now, if you will, at this point, because it seems like you talked about all the things you could do as a kid, right? And what you could buy for a nickel. And it seems like it was pretty close to that from like the 1900s clear through the 1970s. And then from the 70s, we start seeing it, right? We really start seeing this price go up. Now, granted, it was still gradual, but it wasn't as gradual as, say, from 1900 to 1960. So it seems like the speed at which things are happening has increased. Is that true? Is that true or false, or is that just perception?
I think part of it is perception. I'm not saying entirely all of it. Definitely the speed and quantity, but that's a part of the efforts, that what I said earlier about the efforts by the Fed and the government. They can't print money enough to get the effects they want. It's lessening over time. So that's part of it. But part of it is what you just talked about. When you go back and you look at the way things happened, they were relatively stable. But it was in the late 60s, if you remember, when governments finally woke up. And that's because there was a fixed gold price. And we had gone through a depression. So people were more recently thinking about things in terms of the deflation and the depression. They're not thinking of things, the threat of inflation. Now, there was a spurt after the war, but then as the economy improved, the 50s and then the 60s, things were relatively good. But then that's when people started recognizing, wait a second, I can't buy with the dollar today what I could 15 years ago, 20 years ago. And then the oil companies, hey, wait a second, this isn't what we agreed to. Your dollar's not the same, and you raised the price of gold. So they got angry, and rightfully so. So that's when I think people awoke. And what really probably did it, one of the defining events, when President Nixon said, we're not going to give you your gold. The oil embargo was 2 years later. And the gold started going up anyway in price. So they wanted their gold, they couldn't get it. People the world over recognizing the dollar wasn't as good as gold and wasn't what it was supposed to be in terms of value and purchasing power anymore. So you had a period where a lot of things were happening, and now gold's got to find its place. There's a market for gold, we just don't recognize it. That's what Nixon said. Here, you guys want to trade gold, go ahead. We're not going to stop you. And there were forms of gold that US citizens could buy and invest in because they didn't come under the classification. And I think the other reason that the government didn't make an issue about it is because they knew they were fighting a losing battle, and that there had to be a way for people, because there would have been an upheaval. Because they continued to force cheaper dollars on people all the time. So there had to be a way for people to do. So you had this explosion in the price of gold till it could find its value based on what had happened over 30 or 40 years. And you had an Arab oil embargo. Well, you have a combination, and then the effects of the inflation started showing up in the prices of every goods and services. And all of that's happening at the same time. That was an awakening. And So up until 1980, it was like that was the focus. It was kind of like now, oh my gosh, this is going to go crazy. What happened? Well, for one thing, Volcker, chairman of the Fed, Volcker at the time said, we're going to do things differently. We're going to have to do something differently if we want to kick this stuff. And that meant not monetizing the debt. And the focus was on interest rates. Now we've gone way beyond the idea of ever hoping not to monetize the debt, and we're raising interest rates. So it's a combination of two things that are going to be very difficult. But anyway, we came out of that. And as a result of it, and it is, again, it isn't to argue right or wrong. The fact of the matter is what happened. And we had a period, we entered a period of 20 years, the most unbelievable growth, economically speaking, in the history of this country. We rose above all of the problems. You know, the American spirit was never on display better in the 80s and 90s for what happened. We got a little crazy at the end, buying stocks of companies that would likely never show a profit at all, or paying multiples of earnings that were 200 years out. You know, I mean, there was no justification for it. But the point is, there was enough economic activity to justify big increases in stocks over multiple years and even a couple of decades. Wasn't a problem. And then the beginning of the century, we saw several things happen. We've had nothing, we've been on a roller coaster, financially and economically, since the 21st century started. So people are much more aware of it. They see it more quickly now. They're studying it. The people talking about it today weren't the ones that were talking about it 40 years ago. That was me and others who grew up in that area. They don't know what's going on, and they're learning. But unless they have that perspective, it's going to be very difficult to give people advice and tell them what to do. So, but people are aware. But they're aware of it in a way that is, they're convinced, just like the people 40 years ago were, that it was going to continue. That it was going to get out of hand. It was going to go sky high. Gold's going to go sky high. Inflation's going to skyrocket. This is, you know, that's the way they're looking at it. I heard the inflation argument so much from so many people all through the early 80s. And it was like they couldn't get off that kick. They couldn't believe that gold wasn't going to turn around and rocket and go to 1,000. And it dropped as low as $250 an ounce after hitting $850. And it took 20 years to do that. So, but it was all during good times, financially and economically. But we've had, you know, we've seen, we had an economic depression. We had excellent economic conditions and prosperity during the 80s and the 90s. We're likely not looking at good economic times ahead, but it still comes down to what happens to the US dollar. Because you can have economic depression with it. That's not bad for the dollar. That's good for the dollar when deflation is accompanying it. It's only when inflation is there, the effects of inflation are so bad that it cheapens the value very quickly. I'm not convinced that that's where we're going right now.
Gotcha. So real quick, you mentioned this earlier in our conversation, and I wanted to get back to that because I think it's vitally important that people understand what it is. And you mentioned Bretton Woods. Could you just kind of explain what that was?
Well, as much as I've read about that a number of times because it's important, but we don't hear it referred to often enough. Essentially what it was an agreement to let currencies float against each other. And that was where the US secured the agreement that the dollar would be the world's reserve currency, and that as a reserve currency, gold and oil would be priced in dollars. I can tell you that, but I'd feel uncomfortable trying to pick my brain without going back and reading the actual effects of that agreement. But it is what put the dollar in place as the world's reserve currency. And that was probably the most important thing that came out of that for the United States.
That's all right. I caught you off guard with that question. We can cover that.
Very valid question. I just would feel like I need to brush up on it, but it's one of a series of things that have happened over time. The U.S. And the Federal Reserve never stop in their efforts to support the dollar in terms of talking about it and its relationship to other currencies. Their actions, however, are just the opposite, because inflating and cheapening the value is what allows them to function. Governments can spend more money, and the Fed and the banks can create more money and lend it, but they're not going to talk about it that way. And they're not going to make agreements that restrict their ability to do that. So that's why Bretton Woods agreement was important.
And if I'm not mistaken, there was a Bretton Woods 1 and a Bretton Woods 2.
Maybe I believe there was, yes.
Maybe we'll cover that.
We can definitely do that. I think that, those are the kind of things where there's probably a full podcast of material. What did this mean, and how did things happen after that? So.
Yeah, we can cover that later. So let's say, someone's listening to this and they're like feeling moved that they maybe need to have some gold on hand.
Mm-hmm.
Where would you direct them to go to find that gold, right? Because look, if you don't know and you just go to a local pawn shop, there's a big chance you could get taken for a ride, right?
Well, pawn shop is not where to go to buy your gold.
Right. I'm just saying, you could get taken for a ride there.
Do that. Today, it's much easier for people to buy gold than ever was. And that's the nice thing that's come out of it. People talk about gold as an investment. It is not an investment, but if you really want to buy gold, it's a lot easier to do. If you want to buy gold, physical gold, for the purpose of holding and accumulating it yourself, then buy US Gold Eagle coins. That is the best bet. Right now, the premiums on those are about 10%. They used to be around 5 or 6. They have been considerably higher at one time within the last couple of years, but they're back down on the gold to about 10%. So it's reasonable. And that means, in effect, if gold's at 1,800, you're going to pay almost $2,000 for a 1 ounce gold coin. That's the way to purchase it. And you can do that by going online. There's actually probably several different dealers, and I don't like to give out names or say that, but they're competitive, and you should just check them out, talk to somebody there, tell them what you want to do. And again, if you want to buy physical gold coins, buy US Gold Eagles. Don't buy numismatic or collectible coins. Buy the Gold Eagles, the low premium. You could even buy other coins with low premiums, but I would stick with the US Eagles because they're the most widely recognized. And they also have a face value of $50, which at some point may be an issue. It's not at this point. But they're considered legal tender as well. So you can do that online with places and just go check them out, find out what their process is, look at it, compare their prices, and ask. I'm happy to respond when somebody has a question, but I'm not in the business of recommending where and who to do business with, and I don't sell them. So also, you can go to a local coin shop, establish a relationship, talk to the proprietor, and ask him, look, if I just want to pick up a couple of coins, how much will you sell them for? And then ask him, if I came back in tomorrow and the price is the same and I want to sell it back to you, how much will you give me for it? So that you know how much of a differential there is. Now, the typical resale value of a 1 ounce gold eagle coin is the bullion price of gold. So if gold's $1,800 an ounce and you buy it at 19 something, you can expect to go back in and get 1,800 for it. For the lower premium, that's even better. Let's say you buy it at 18 and sell it at 1,900 even. Maybe it's a 5% premium or 6%. That's okay. If gold goes to 2,500, you sell it back for 2,500. If it drops to 1,500, you can sell it for 1,500. Just watch the price of gold. That's the most realistic, simplest way for people to want to own and accumulate gold. Now, if you want to trade or speculate on the price and where you think it's going, one way or the other, then there's umpteen different ways to do it. There's paper representations of the gold price. You can buy and sell gold stocks, which I would never recommend to buy gold stocks. Again, unless you're speculating and you're just looking for something that's might go up at a certain clip at a certain time. But by and large, overall, it's better to own physical gold than it is gold stocks or any paper gold products. And US Gold Eagle coins is the best way, unless you have larger amounts of money and you want to buy real bullion and you have a place to store it, third party or on your own.
Gotcha. Is there any dead giveaways for pitfalls when you're looking at gold? Anything that people should, if they read something, just as an example, right now, my diet, I stay away from anything that's processed, right? Any words I can't really pronounce, I stay away from it. Are there any things that people should read, if they read about it and go, ooh, I remember I should stay away from that? What would that be?
If you're looking at something that is going to cost you more than that 10% premium I just talked about, you probably had not ought to pursue it. Because a lot of the coin dealers, and again, this depends on the dealer, are going to focus on collectible coin, numismatic coins, coins that have a value other than their gold content. And where that portion, that amount of premium for their values, a premium for those that would be much higher because it's based on collectability. The problem is it's very subjective. So how much of that premium is realistic? The more unscrupulous someone may be, the higher they might have that premium stack. So that's where you got to check. I'm not saying don't buy numismatic, but if your purpose is owning gold, stick with the gold, the US Gold Eagles. If you know what you're doing and you have studied it, there are certain coins that you might want to look at, but you're buying more than gold there. And you're depending on it's like buying high-priced artwork. Really, do you really need or want to own the Mona Lisa if you could? And how much is it worth? And how much will it be worth after a depression? So, and you now bring that down to a level where, okay, you're going to spend a couple $1,000s. You could buy a 1 ounce gold eagle, or you could buy a $5 gold coin, which has much that was minted 125 years ago and has maybe 1/5 the amount of gold in it of a 1 ounce gold coin, and you pay $3,000 for it. See, if your objective was own the gold, you got a lot more than. I'm not saying that coin's not worth it, but is that what you want? So you have to be careful. Then you have the possibility that maybe you paid too much for it anyway. Maybe that premium was closer to the price you paid for the coin, 2,000 for the 1 ounce coin instead of 3, but you're still buying an awful lot of subjective value, collectability versus gold content. So you just kind of have to look at them, ask questions, and study it. Don't get caught up with the carats or the purity. What you have to know is how much gold is in the coin. If you can't get a straight answer, walk away.
Great. Well, Kelsey, as before the last time, it's awesome to talk to you because you're able to take these principles and break them down in a way that even a guy like I can understand. And if I can understand it, listening to you, I know anyone else can. You're also a prolific writer. Where can people go to find your publications, your books, your newsletters, all of it? Where can they go?
All right. First place would be my website, KelseyWilliamsGold.com. That's the URL, and it's called Kelsey's Gold Facts. But if you type either of those in, you'll find it. But that's where all of my articles are listed there. There's over 200 of them now. Gold, inflation, Federal Reserve, silver, deflation, hyperinflation, real estate, modern monetary theory. To whatever extent I've written about it, it's on that site. I'm also a founding contributor to Talk Markets. Talk Markets is a quasi financial social website. And I have articles there and a profile page, talkmarkets.com. My articles also appear regularly on several other websites around the world. Goldseaton.de, which is in Germany. They translate my articles and publish them there. I'm on marketoracle.co.uk, the United Kingdom. I'm also on goldeagle.com, goldseek.com, FX Empire, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. My books, I have a author page on Amazon, and my books are listed for sale on Amazon. And there's also links to my books and other things on every article I write and on my website.
Awesome.
And they can look around and see whatever they want.
That's
hopefully
awesome.
learn some things.
Perfect. Is there anything that we didn't cover on this episode that you wanted to go over?
No, I can't think, of anything that we haven't. This feels good. It feels right. And besides, we could find something and then we'll just come back and talk again.
Absolutely. Well, Kelsey, man, as always, it was awesome to talk to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Dave, for having me on.
All right, everyone. Bye.